A lot of you are being exposed to the dairy drama, right? You're being exposed to the dairy by eating other people's foods as you travel or as you visit families and relatives. And so let's talk a little bit about what are some of the dairy dangers involved with people who are gluten sensitive. So if you're watching this show, strong likelihood you already know you've got a problem with gluten. But many people go gluten-free and they continue to consume dairy. And so we're going to just kind of do an overview. If you want to deep dive on all these topics, I want to encourage you to go watch my crash course on dairy as well. But we're going to really predominantly tonight, we're going to be focusing on this issue and why it's so important. But these are some of the dangers, again, involved in consuming dairy if you are gluten sensitive. Now, one of them is a lot of dairies contain added gums, and some of these added gums are very difficult to digest. So if your gut is already damaged as a result of years of gluten-induced damage and it doesn't digest very well, you're already struggling with digestive problems, to consume dairy with tons of added gums can be very problematic and cause a lot of indigestion and other issues. Now, a lot of your dairies too, a lot of your dairy products have added hormones. Many of these hormones have been contributed to or have been shown to at least contribute to the development of leaky gut. So we don't need those when we're trying to recover from years of gluten-induced leaky gut. We know several dairy products contain a substance known as meat glue or microbial transglutaminase. We know that meat glue, there's some research studies that links it to gluten mimicry, meaning it can do the same kind of damage that gluten can do for some individuals. And then we also know that dairy in and of itself, particularly casein, which is the protein found in dairy, can mimic gluten, and this is why you hear a lot of people going gluten-free, casein-free diets, especially in the autistic community where kids are going both dairy and gluten-free as a result of gluten and casein having similar properties and cross-reacting. And then we also know there's something called BCM7 from A1 milk. Now, if you don't know what A1 milk is versus A2 milk, this show is, we're not going to go into the depths of that. Again, go back and watch my comprehensive crash course on dairy to get that differentiation. But bottom line here is that BCM7 acts like an opioid. And so it can create addiction. But the other component here is there's a linkage to autoimmune disease. So some people that react to this BCM7, it can actually induce and trigger autoimmune disease. The autoimmune disease it's most commonly been linked to is type 1 diabetes. So, you think about this, if you're a parent and you've got small children and you're wondering whether or not they should be drinking cow's milk from A1 cows with BCM7 in it, you do have an increased risk for the potentiation of type 1 diabetes. And by the way, type 1 diabetes and gluten are genetically linked. They share the same genotypical patterns of risk. So these are all reasons why dairy can be potentially a problem. Now, some other things that I will just bring to your attention shortly is that cows eat grass. Okay, hopefully this is not like rocket science, brand new information. If you've never been to a farm and you've never seen a cow, then it might be. But cows eat grass. I hope that's not a newsflash, right? Cows should not, and their staple food should not be grain. In essence, cows are not designed to eat predominant grain silage. But on commercial dairy farms, cows eat grain. And usually the grain that they're fed is used to what? To fatten the cows. It's used as a source of calories on dairy farms to increase milk production. But unfortunately, this grain is loaded with glyphosate, pesticides, unless you're using organic, but we still have the problem of grain containing high levels of mycotoxins, mold toxins, that can, you don't want those in your diet to any great degree. So we know mold and mycotoxins are a predominant source of grain. But we also know that many of these grains are GMO, meaning we've genetically manipulated them, and now we're feeding the cow genetically manipulated food with mold toxins and pesticides. Where do you think this stuff ends up? It ends up in the milk, and then it ends up in you, or it ends up in your child, or it ends up in your baby. And is that what you want as a staple food feeding your family? And that fundamentally, that's a decision you get to make, but it's a decision I would encourage you to make with these things in mind. Now, the other thing that we know is that cows eat grass, and so if you pump them full of grain, what has not been studied is, does dairy from a cow contain gluten? Nobody knows. Why? We haven't studied it. What we have studied is we've studied humans, and we know that, for example, a mother who's eating gluten and breastfeeding her baby, if her baby's gluten sensitive, she can pass gluten through her breast milk to that child. That actually has been studied. It has not been studied in dairy cows, the passage of gluten into humans who drink it. So, but it is something that we have this big question mark by. Is this one of the reasons why so many people with gluten sensitivity do so poorly with dairy? And in my opinion, the answer is yes. This could be one of the reasons, along with all of these other factors, also along with all of these other factors as well that I was just talking about on this slide. Again, the meat glue, the added gums, the added hormones, the molecular mimicry, the BCM7, and then as well the lactase deficiency. Let's talk more about what that means. Moving on here. So I want to point just a couple points of reference here. So this study was published in the journal Digestion in 2005. You see the conclusion of this research was this, very important. A high prevalence of celiac disease was observed in patients with a positive H2 lactose breath test, meaning compared to healthy people. In these subjects, lactase deficiency seemed to be, very important here, the only, let's change that color, the only manifestation of celiac disease. In other words, these patients had no symptoms, no GI symptoms, had no major manifestation of pain, etc. in the gastrointestinal tract. The only symptom that they manifested as a result was the fact that they were lactase deficient and couldn't handle dairy. So even again, it's important to understand that you may not have a diagnosis. You may be on a gluten-free diet. You may not be on a gluten-free diet. You may not have celiac disease, or you may have celiac disease. What this research is showing is that sometimes the only manifestation of symptoms in celiac disease is lactase deficiency, meaning you don't tolerate the ability to digest milk. Now, I think it's important to point out the difference, because a lot of you may be confused about the difference between lactose intolerance and protein allergy from cow's milk. They're not the same thing. Very, very different. If we very simply summarize what an intolerance is poor digestion. They cannot digest. There's a sugar found in dairy called lactose. It's the predominant sugar found in dairy. And this lactose is broken down in the GI tract by your good bacteria, your friendly flora. Break this sugar down into smaller substrates, and many people lack the enzyme called lactase. So again, lactase helps to break down lactose. And if you can't do that very well or efficiently, it's called a lactose intolerance, versus a protein allergy to milk protein, which is an allergic response that leads to an immune inflammation. So this one leads directly to an immune inflammatory process. So immune inflammation is what we get from eating the protein. And again, the lactose intolerance, look at some of these other statistics here. So you can see it's rare before 2 years of age. Okay, it generally occurs in the GI tract. It takes several hours after the consumption of the food to start seeing symptoms. Some of the common symptoms here are listed: nausea, vomiting, gas, bloating, diarrhea, abdominal pain, borborygmi, which is basically like gurgling or rumbling in the GI tract, abdominal cramps. And diagnostically, these people have a positive hydrogen breath test, positive lactose hydrogen breath test. And some require dietary modification, meaning get off the dairy altogether. Some can do well with this if they add a digestive enzyme that can help break down lactose to their diet. We'll talk more in depth about that here shortly. Versus this cow's milk allergy protein, which generally, again, it's an immune system response. Any age of onset it can occur at. It's not just in children. It can occur in 30 and 40 and 50-year-olds. It affects the gut. It affects the skin. It can affect the respiratory system. Really, this should say all systems, not just skin and respiratory. Less than 1 to 2 hours after ingestion, the symptoms can manifest. This is what we would call acute allergy, but then there's also something called a delayed allergy. And so the time framing of a delayed response is up to 3 weeks. So delayed response is a little bit different than acute response. Again, we add that to this diagram. And then symptoms, very common symptoms: rash, eczema, hives, edema, headache, wheezing, shortness of breath, anaphylaxis, skin prick test, and allergy testing are the diagnostic confirmations. But again, this is generally, these two generally are IgE. What's IgE is the acute response. Remember, we can do IgG, IgA, IgM, immune complex, and T cell response reactions as well. And those are called delayed hypersensitivities. Not exactly the same thing, but they're still an immune response. And a lot of times what happens, people go get the skin prick or the allergy test for cow's milk protein allergy. Those tests can come back falsely negative because it's not that a person is not necessarily allergic or not allergic to the dairy. It's that they just maybe haven't been tested comprehensively for all the different ways they could be allergic to it. And I think that's a good point that needs to be made if you're trying to figure this out. So again, an intolerance is an inability or poor digestion of a sugar called lactose, whereas a protein allergy is the immunological or immune response to the protein aspect of the dairy. Either way, they're different things that can lead to different types of symptoms, but some of the symptoms have overlap. Hey, don't forget to check out the rest of the series right here. Make sure you hit subscribe below. And as always, thanks for tuning in.